Ladies and gentlemen, the great Andrzej Marczewski.
Oh, good grief. Do not look for the first book. I've taken it out of publication. It was dreadful. But there are some good books for kids about cogs that you can find on me. So yeah, I'm Andrzej Marczewski. To some of you, I am Dave Rage on Twitter. To others of you, I am DAverage on Twitter. I am indeed a solution consultant, gamification solution consultant for Motivate. As a company, we use gamification for engagement solutions, loyalty, pretty much anything that you can think of applying gamification to, we'll give it a go. Because we believe that gamification, amongst a lot of other tools, quite important to mention, is a really good way of solving problems around engagement, learning, whatever it may be. And what I want to talk to you today about is, as we've heard, is this idea of limitations. Now, the reason this came up is because when Vasilis was talking to me about what we wanted to do for the talk, he was talking about from player to professional. And I think one of the things that, as a player, so I've been involved in gamification since about 2011, started doing it as a proper job from about 2015. So the 2011 part of me, and the book may contest to that if you ever do find it, was very idealistic. I had a very sort of high-level understanding of what gamification could achieve, but I didn't have necessarily the understanding of what realistically you can do in the world. Because we've heard a lot of really interesting talks in the last sort of day or two, where you could almost sit back and think they could have done more. And you always, as a designer, you think, I could have done more. And that's the 2011 version of me. The 2018 version of me goes, my God, where did they get the budget to even do that? Because the reality is, and there's a great talk yesterday that was really inspiring to me, is that for every good idea, there is a limitation to why you might not be able to do that idea. And there's a great comment yesterday about the virtual reality leg. And that cost like 20 million, whatever it was. And so the whole body was going to cost 220 million. And that scalability becomes a really big issue when you're talking to clients about what they want to do. And the idea of there's another great slide, virtual reality to pinball. So you promise virtual reality, they want virtual reality and they get pinball. Actually, I'll be quite happy with pinball. If you've not played it, there's one upstairs, it's great fun. But the point is, sometimes the reality of it and the growing up part of you as a professional as you go into gamification is knowing where that balance point is, understanding that there are limitations, but those limitations shouldn't stop you doing things. So I'm going to use a case study. A company that we're working with, Zebra Technologies, they're a technology company who, like a lot of technology companies, have grown through absorbing other companies. It's what technology companies do. They buy people. And what that creates is a really interesting dynamic where you've got people who are original members of the company and people who are new members, and they're across the world, and they all come together, and suddenly they're all expected to be on the same page. They're all expected to have a full understanding of the company they're now part of, whereas yesterday they were a different company. So they came to us, and they had a challenge for us. And the challenge was to create a gamified onboarding experience for new hires. And there were several different parts to the brief, but the ones that are interesting were they wanted to standardize the onboarding so that wherever you were, initially in EMEA, you would get the same materials delivered in an interesting way. That would teach you about Zebra, would give you an understanding of the culture and some of the things that make Zebra what they are. And obviously that was fun and engaging. Now, anyone who knows me and has heard my talks, I very rarely talk about fun. It's just one of those things that I try and avoid in talks about gamification. And as we've heard a few times here, fun isn't the outcome you're looking for. It is a byproduct of a good system. What you're looking for is the business objectives to be met. Thank you. Thank you, Vasilis. But if you're good at your job as a gamification designer, then often what you produce should be fun. Sometimes you don't want it to be fun. As we heard yesterday, there are certain circumstances where the topics you are dealing with aren't fun. And some of the clients we're talking with at the moment, they're dealing with very, very difficult topics, and making them fun is to devalue them. So, but in this instance, they wanted fun because they're a fun company, they're a really interesting company, and they wanted to kind of show the innovation that this company is well known for. But there were some limitations to this, and this is where we had to really start to think, because the onboarding materials that we were given, we couldn't change. Now, ideally, as a gamification designer, you're going to want to take the materials on board and then create something really exciting with the materials, gamifying the content, making that content itself more engaging. Now, that's not something we had the luxury to do at the time for a number of different reasons. One of those was time. As everybody here who's worked on a project knows, you get given a brief and you think, oh, that's about 8 months' work there, and you've got 8 weeks to do it. We had longer than that, luckily, but it wasn't something we were going to get too involved with either, because of the fact that the materials could change quite rapidly. As they were growing and things changing internally, we needed to be able to update those materials quickly. And if you gamify all the materials, then what you're effectively doing is you're building in like a redundancy to those materials, because you can't update them. To update something, you then have to re-gamify the next version. So there are some things around that. Budget, of course, budget. We could go to them and say we want £8 million to do this, and they'll say you've got £3. They didn't, thankfully, but there was a fixed budget they had in mind that we were going to work to. So some of the more exciting ideas that I would say were exciting at the time got left behind because they were impractical to achieve in the time and the budget. But good ideas are never lost. Never worry about losing good ideas, because good ideas come back again. If you've had a really great idea and you've had to cut it from one project, it might reappear in another one. Or when you've proven the value of something with a client, it might reappear in the next version. So never get disheartened by having to drop great game mechanics or great concepts, because you can always reuse them. The ones that are terrible, don't worry about dropping, because sometimes you come up with a great idea that you thought was amazing and everyone else around you just goes, nah, sorry. And again, you have to take that on the chin. Some of the arguments that you have in an office where you've got lots of creative people and you've got this great idea and you've got 12 people saying to you, no, it's rubbish. And you're stood there, stood your ground, ready for it. Yeah, I'm going to take this one. And eventually you have to go, if they're all saying it's rubbish, there might be something in this. So another part of going from player to professional is accepting that sometimes. Just accepting that maybe the majority is right and then sneaking it in elsewhere later. I'm never wrong. And the other thing which got us by surprise was scope expansion. Now, this isn't the same as scope creep. Now, everyone has been on the project where you start with, an example, a really bad example. You start with, like, we want these 3 mechanics. And that's a terrible example of gamification people. But say there's like 3 mechanics. And then the next day there's 4. And the next day there's 5. And every time you speak to the client, they've thought of something else they want to add. So what initially started as this tiny little 2-week project suddenly becomes a 6-month project, and you've still got 2 weeks to do it. That's scope creep, and we all come against that. The scope expansion actually was, as soon as people outside of it, or as soon as the guys in EMEA started talking about this, everyone else wanted it. They suddenly saw this really interesting thing. We saw the prototypes, saw the demos, spoke to the people who were helping us their end design it, and suddenly America wanted it, and then Asia wanted it. So what started off was going to be a fairly small program suddenly became global. And that brought with it some really interesting other sort of limitations, or not limitations, but complexities to the project. Because what happened was they hadn't done a project on a global scale like this. So suddenly you have one little group in EMEA who's got this nice little project they wanted to do, and that grows into a global project, which means you've got every other region then wants a stake in it. So back to the fixed materials, what starts off as, oh, we've got this stuff we use in the UK, and that's okay for everyone else, suddenly becomes, well, America does it this way, Asia does it this way. So suddenly, there's a lot more to do in a similar time period with a different set of content to what you thought you were going to be using. So these all add together to make what looked like a horrendous problem. Actually, for us, it's a really, really interesting challenge. Because you still have to do the project. You still got to deliver to the client something you thought was going to be amazing. And that leads to some real creativity. Something I've always found is when you limit stuff, you actually have to become quite creative. And this is what games do really well. Because games limit your abilities sometimes to make you think about a challenge. How many people have played an adventure game, especially back in the late 90s, where the solution for it was so obscure because you were limited to having a fork and you needed to launch a rocket to the moon? And those limitations make creative decisions happen. And sometimes I find that actually cutting back a lot of the stuff around your problem can help you. Because sometimes you've got this position where you have 100,000 ideas and you have to nail it down to something coherent. Actually, if you start at the other end and you've got far fewer to choose from, then you can spend more time on the good ideas and start being creative around those. So we created something called Zebra Island. And it's a sort of it's an interactive experience, narrative-driven, where people on their first day are invited to save the island. And a series of different stations they go through. There's missions in each station, there's materials, and it, on the surface, looks like a very, very simple solution because it's a delivery mechanism for the existing materials. But that in itself becomes quite difficult to do, because if it's a delivery mechanism, why not just use the intranet? Why not just have a content management system? So you have to build something around it that helps deliver it in a way that becomes engaging to people. And this is one of the things that in education becomes a real issue, because whenever you try and gamify education, the majority of the time when you speak with teachers, they have materials they've been using for decades. And you can't always change those materials. And it was very similar for this. You can't affect the materials necessarily. You have to augment them. You have to add stuff that makes it interesting and makes the learner want to take that journey with you. So in this case, we wanted to take people who were coming into the company. We wanted to teach them about the company. We wanted to get them excited about the company, show them something different. In this room, who has been through a standard onboarding experience? And by standard, I mean 2 days of PowerPoint. Yep, probably half the room. So you come into the company, you sit down, and some poor guy from marketing who's just been grabbed that morning has to come in and deliver the marketing talk. And it's a series of slides that they've been using for the last 2 years, and they go, and this is the intranet, and this is our network, and this is how you get your part, and you do that for 2 days. We wanted to break away from that slightly. We wanted to create an experience where people got all that information in a way that was a bit more interesting, and in a way that was easy to standardize across regions. So every person, no matter what office they start in, gets the same core information delivered in exactly the same way. So that when you come to somebody who's been through this, wherever you are, and you ask them a question, they should have the same answer as everybody else. And that's really important when you're looking at brand advocacy. I've worked in consultancies where when you say to somebody, what does the company do? You'll get answer A. You then go to the person next to them and say, what does the company do? You get answer B. And so on. And by the time you've spoken to 100 people, you've had 100 different answers what the company does. Because there's no one coherent message, because they've all been told something different by whoever onboarded them, or whichever region they were in, or whatever office they're in, whatever department they're part of. They all have a slightly different view of what the company does. So this is one thing we were really trying to avoid by creating a system where everybody did the same thing. They all experienced it in the same way. We don't need no points and badges. So one of the things we imposed on ourselves was we didn't want to use points and badges. Now, actually, there are some badges, but they, if you see in the top right, there's like a little face. If you click on that, it gives you a profile. And the profile tells you which stations you've completed. So each one of these little sort of yellow shapes is a station. And that was purely because we needed people to understand their progress through the system. They didn't get like a big thing flash up saying you've won a badge. That was just progression. The only real mechanic that you can see here is a timer and a progress bar. And the timer has 30 days on it. So it's hardly a time pressure thing. It's just that we wanted to make sure there was a limit to how long people were on it. But what the delivery mechanism is, what the island does, is it pushes narrative to you. So you go into the first room and you are presented with a console, and that's it. A little message comes up saying, look around. So you move your mouse around and something highlights, and it's a product, and it tells you about the product. You move over a screen, and the screen tells you, you click on the screen, it flashes, click on the screen, and you suddenly get your first bit of information about the company. And it looks like a kind of a Windows interface. So it's all quite familiar, you know what you're doing, you click on it, PDF comes up. Not all that exciting, when PDF's never all that exciting. Although actually, to be fair, the company, their videos look like Marvel trailers, they're incredible. So we were quite lucky that the core content in itself was quite interesting, but a PDF's still a PDF. Once you've closed that, another pop-up comes up saying, whilst you've been doing this, we've just uncovered this recording. So you listen to the recording, and it's a video, and you see Dr. Brennan talking about what's happened, and you know, something bad's happening to the island. We need somebody to come and sort something out. And that kind of triggers something's going on here. And it also triggers a little bit of understanding of, if I do stuff, I will see interesting things happening. You do a few more things, you unlock a little puzzle. Again, the puzzle doesn't add to the learning at this point, it just shows you that there is a puzzle. And that along the way, it sets the rules, it sets the parameters of the world, that there are videos and interesting things happening, there's a story happening, and there are games and puzzles to be done. That's all within the first few minutes of the game. And then once you've done that, the whole of the island unlocks, and you get to go around it any way you want to. You can choose to go down to dunes, up to the Arctic, giving the player some sort of freedom to move around. And as they progress, more of the story unlocks. Now, this is where the creative bit comes in. This is where the sort of the crux of it is. We didn't want to create a really standard gamified system. We didn't want to give them points and badges because we wanted it to be something that was a little bit different, they hadn't seen before. In hindsight, points could have been helpful and may come back one day, because that allows you then to create different parts to the system, and actually we record points in the background. Every action has points assigned to it, we just don't show them it, so that we can do some of the metrics afterwards. But the narrative itself was what we had to get really creative with, because fixed time, fixed budget, you don't have time to go and get a film crew in, you don't have the budget to get voice recording artists in particularly, so you get an office full of creative people making stuff. And that's where the fun comes. You've got me doing my posh voice of, hello, this is Dr. Brown talking to you about, and things like this, so that it's us doing things. It's our creativity being shown directly to these people in a way that was fun for them. So you unlock cassette recordings that explain how to restart the generator on the island, because part of the problem with the island is the power's gone down. You get little snippets of emails that kind of explain something that's happened. You see a FaceTime video of an engineer who's stuck in the storm and like talking to his mum. You see little clips of pictures which have post-it notes on them with little tiny bits of story. So as they go through whatever direction they want to go through it, they start to build a picture of the story. And as they kind of start to get deeper into the story, they obviously want to progress and start to understand it. That's the whole point. Curiosity starts to kick in. They want to understand what happens next. They want to know why the island has gone down, what the problems are, how they can solve them. And all the while, they're still looking at the materials. They're getting some reinforcing puzzles at the end of certain sections just to prove that they've actually looked at some of this stuff and read it. So there'll be like a little sort of gamified test or a drag and drop or something, fairly standard educational materials at that point. But again, they link into the overall narrative. They have to understand that to then be able to get through that, unlock everything. And eventually, when they hit a certain point, they unlock a special kind of different overlay that shows them where the generator is. And the generator, at 80% of progress, they can see where it is, they can go and look at it, but they can't actually do anything to it. They have to have unlocked all of the words along the left as they go through to then be able to get to the generator, unlock it, and put in a special password that then lets them complete it. And they see like a nice kind of movie-style trailer explaining that they've helped save the island, but there's so much more to be done, so that you've got the expandability going through. And it was really interesting for us because it meant that we had to really, really think about what we were trying to do and justify every part of it. We didn't have time to build lots of things. We would have loved to have had millions of pounds to build the next Grand Theft Auto for Zebra. That would have been amazing. But would it have been relevant? Would it have made sense? Yeah, probably not. Would we have liked to have done it? Absolutely, of course we would. Who wouldn't want to? And the other decision we made was to make it single player. Now, I know there is a thing in gamification, and I have spoken about it many a time, that relatedness is incredibly important. But who can tell me what the single biggest selling individual entertainment product is of all time? One thing. Yeah, go on. Grand Theft Auto 5. Admittedly by their own stats, but a couple of months back it came out that this was the single biggest selling entertainment entity of all time, bigger than films, music, everything. Pinch of salt needed, maybe. But the point is, it's a single player game. So single player isn't the enemy. You just have to do it well, and you have to make it interesting. You have to understand that as an individual, there may be other things they need. So when you're looking at onboarding, one of the most important things in onboarding somebody is getting to know other people. So does this replace the entire onboarding? No, of course not. You still have to have that face-to-face moment with people you know and get to know other people within the company. Does this mean that more time can be spent on that and less time on delivering PowerPoints? Absolutely. Because once they've done this, they don't need the PowerPoint presentations anymore. They've already seen them, and they've enjoyed seeing them because it allowed them to unlock some of the rest of the story. So when you're making these decisions, you have to justify them to yourself. And those limitations I was speaking about at the beginning, sometimes you'll go, well, you know, we could make it sort of asynchronous multiplayer, and people will be going around the map, and you'll see different things happening. And you kind of look at it and go, does that add to the game? Or the overall experience. I use the word game terribly here. But does it add to the experience? Actually, no, it doesn't. It might be interesting feedback for some people to see that 15 other people have done the same route as them, or there are 5 other people currently on the game at the same time. And there is a chat room that if they want to, they can go in. Each room has a different chat box that they can go into if they're getting stuck. But the overall experience is individual because we wanted them to really be absorbed into the experience, not into chatting with people. That was more important to us. One day, maybe, version 5 of this could be a whole 3D world where you see everyone in real time at the same time. And we've certainly discussed that internally with things that we could do with it. But we felt that this fitted the brief and achieved the business objectives. And we know that it did because everyone who's been on it has told us this. We've surveyed people and said, was it interesting? Did you like it? And we've had a really high approval rating for it. 4 or 5 out of 5 stars for 95% of the users who we've surveyed have said, we liked it. It was good. It was a good experience. We found it useful. Better understanding of Zebra and its values. Learning materials are easier to digest. The game-like feel and story makes Zebra Island engaging to use and sustain interest throughout. And these are statements that came up repeatedly throughout the surveying of what we had done, because that was what was important to us, that the game-like feel sustained the interest. Because when you're delivering something like that, you need to keep that interest going, because the materials themselves aren't necessarily going to be exciting every time. We were lucky that some of them were, but you look at school kids doing maths, if they've got a maths worksheet, it's still a maths worksheet, and they've still got to do it. If you're going to deliver it to them in a way that's more interesting, maybe doing it helps them unlock something else and do something more interesting afterwards, then great. And actually, one of the things I haven't mentioned, we avoided games to a certain extent, but we did do one thing just for the sake of it, because I built it, that Zebra Drop game. It's a game that serves no purpose in there whatsoever other than to recharge them. And it was just purely because somebody said, shall we have a game in there? And I said, I'll build one. So I did. And sometimes that's fine. Doing stuff just because it's fun is okay. It doesn't damage it, as long as it doesn't detract from the experience. There was a purpose for it being there. It helped people recognize certain products. you tie the gameplay and the game theme into the overall product, makes perfect sense. I think what we sometimes fall into the trap of is taking a game and then slapping education or materials at it and saying, here is a gamified experience of education, when actually it's a game with some bits of education attached to it. I'm lucky enough to have reviewed some serious games for a conference over the last few years, and some of the worst ones I've seen have been where you can play the game without ever seeing the educational materials. I played one where you're jumping around, going up this tower, and I was able to complete the game without ever touching the question marks that gave us the materials. So it was a great fun game, but I have no idea what it was trying to teach me. So one of the the things we had to really make sure was anything we included was there for a purpose. And yes, whilst it is just fun, there was actually a secret purpose that it helped people with some recognition of products. But yeah, for us overall, that having those limitations led to some really creative conversations. And if you're lucky enough to work in a team, you've got to have those conversations, and you've got to be mature enough to accept that the limitations that you are set at the beginning will mean some of your ideas don't happen and have to get shed out. And it's one of the hardest things that is, as a designer, to have something you absolutely love and be told it's got to be dropped. It's painful. And and as I said, you will stand your ground and you will fight it, and eventually you have to just take that pill and say, next time. Because that's what the nature of limitations does. It means you have to think much harder about what you're going to do. And I think that will create a better product. Because for me, the limitations are just challenges to overcome and be converted into opportunities. Everyone here has come up against a project where the budget and the time or the constraints around the project have made them feel like it's not possible to do. The ones who have succeeded are the ones who then stopped and went, actually, there's still stuff I can do. It's not the end of the world. It's not my ideal situation. But I can still do something with this. But I just have to think creatively about it. I have to stop being the player, and I have to start being the professional. I have to put the professional hat on and say, the job's got to be done, and I'm going to do it the best I can, in spite of the limitations. So that's my key message to you. Work within your limitations and be as creative as you can to break out of those limitations. Thank you.
Unfortunately, our time with you is also limited. Maybe
Good.
we can turn it into an opportunity for maybe one question. Yes, yes, yes. Vasilis is already happy with it. Do we have questions? Yeah, that need to be answered right now.
My question is, you said I have a limited budget that drives creativity. Could you give one example of a very high budget goal you had and how you scaled it down? Like of a huge idea and then the actually paid for idea because it was a very high level presentation.
So the whole project, we had originally had in our mind of doing a big 3D world, proper rendered 3D, people could explore it and go around it. And then as we started to see the limitations of what we could really achieve within time and budget, it became a 2D world, which became a bit more of an interactive environment that way. Actually, it worked better because it meant that it was much less resource intensive. We could deliver it through a web browser much more easily. So that actually made it a much easier project to deliver to the client across different devices, platforms, browser types. It was so yeah, that was the big one. We wanted to go huge and had to come back down to something that really delivered what we needed in a succinct way.
Great example, thank you. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Yeah, thank you, Andrzej Marczewski.